more in this next report. Take a look.
Piece together a timeline of the footage. There was no sign from Moscow that any to a combat zone in Ukraine. Reports to show the start of a sudden attack are so-called dragon's teeth in dollars. According to a post last year from an organization created by Ukrainian Special Operations Forces, nearly all of the Kursk border strongholds had been deserted. The post cited corruption as a factor. Regular Russian troops, FSB border forces, and the National Guard all share responsibility for defending the border. Brady Afric is a U.S. analyst that maps Russian defenses.
In Kursk region, Russians' fortifications in this area tended to have fewer anti-vehicle ditches, fewer obstacles, and fewer fighting positions when compared to positions in occupied southern Ukraine. It was likely easier for Ukrainian forces to progress around and through Russia's fortifications in the region, especially if they were manned by fewer or poorly trained personnel.
In Russia, panic is spreading. Videos obtained by Reuters show fighter jets flying overhead near Suja. In town, a man films damage to buildings. Alexei Smirnov is the acting regional governor in Kursk and has been in the job for only a few months. On social media, he tells people to take shelter and issues missile warnings. On a community channel, one commenter asks, "Where are the shelters in Suja?" Reuters made multiple attempts to contact residents through social media, but they were ignored or blocked. For the first day of the incursion, Russian President Vladimir Putin remained silent. The first public remarks on Kursk came the next day, August 7th. Putin called it a large-scale provocation from Kyiv. Military Chief Gerasimov says Russian forces, quote, stopped a force of up to 1,000 Ukrainian soldiers. Although one analyst told Reuters it's possible he may have been under pressure to deliver good news to Putin on TV, or may have been given poor information himself. For his part, acting Governor Smirnov issued false reassurances, saying Russian soldiers and FSB border guards prevented a border breach. Those statements would quickly be disproved by events on the ground. Ukraine has not said much about the planning of the attack. The Russian Defense Ministry did not reply to requests for comment, and Ukraine's armed forces declined to comment about ongoing operations. Kyiv has said its aim is to carve out a buffer zone and wear down Russia's war machine. President Volodymyr Zelensky acknowledged fighting in Kursk for the first time on August 10th, characterizing it as restoring justice and ensuring necessary pressure on its aggressor. Ukraine says it has seized over 90 settlements on the defensive elsewhere, upping the ante of the high-stakes gamble in Kursk.
Will Zelensky's buffer zone tactic pay off, or has Ukraine walked into Putin's trap? Continuous coverage on WION.
All right, so let's start with the big story that we're tracking on WION at this hour. Now, Russia has ruled out any possibility of peace talks with Ukraine amidst Kiev's fresh advances that it has made into the Russian territory of Kursk. Now, the latest missile attack followed a drone attack on Kiev late on Monday. And this is what Kiev's military has said. And these attacks have come as the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has appealed again to the Western leaders to be allowed to use long-range Storm Shadow missiles to hit into the Russian territory.
If our partners lifted all the current restrictions on the use of weapons on Russian territory, we would not need to physically enter, particularly the Kursk region, to protect our Ukrainian citizens in the border communities and eliminate Russia's potential for aggression.
An American official, however, has told The Telegraph that there was no need to send Storm Shadow missiles into Russia because the homemade suicide drones that were being used by Ukraine were already doing the job. Now, Zelensky has further claimed that Ukraine now controls as much as 1,250 square kilometers and 92 settlements in the Kursk region.
Ukrainian warriors continue the defensive operation in the designated areas of the Kursk region. As of today, our forces control more than 1,250 square kilometers of enemy territory and 92 settlements. We continue to strengthen our positions, stabilize designated areas, and, what is very important, replenish the exchange fund for Ukraine.
Now, the Ukrainian president further added that his country's assault in Russia's Kursk region shows that Kremlin threats retaliation were a complete bit of a bluff. Now, Zelensky has said that Ukraine was achieving its objectives. Officials previously said that the objectives include stretching the Russian forces, creating a buffer zone inside the Russian territory, and also seeking an end to the war on much more fairer terms. Now, President Vladimir Putin has demanded that Ukraine should cede swathes of territory if it wants a ceasefire. Now, on the other hand, Volodymyr Zelensky is demanding Russia's full withdrawal from the Ukrainian territory, including from the Crimean Peninsula, and reparations for the damages that have been caused in the course of this war. Now, Moscow said on Monday that Ukraine had struck a third bridge in an assault on Russia's Kursk region. Now, the Russian Defense Ministry has said that it has thwarted the Ukrainian attacks on 3 more villages in Donetsk. Moscow said that it has captured the town of Artemovo, one of the largest Russian gains in recent weeks. It has also released a video showing the aftermath of a firefight in the Kursk region in which a number of Ukrainian military vehicles were destroyed by a unit of Russian Marines. Now, bracing for a further assault, Ukraine has ordered for the evacuation of families from the key city of Pokrovsk as Moscow's forces are inching closer to the logistical hub. Now, according to the local administration, an estimated 53,000 Ukrainian civilians are still present in the city. Ukrainian artillery fired on a bus stop in the city of Donetsk, which is under Russia's control. And Ukraine has said that Russian attacks have killed at least about 4 people on the frontline settlements of Turetsk and Zhirikne. All right, now to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening at this moment in the Russia-Ukraine war, we're being joined by Mr. Ben Aris, who's a founder and editor-in-chief of BNE Intel News and also a former Moscow bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph. He's joining us live on this broadcast. Now, Mr. Aris, this is a pretty important statement that the Russians have made, where they've said that they will not negotiate, considering the fact that Ukraine has now carried out incursion deep into the Kursk region. And according to the Ukrainians, they continue to gain more and more territory. With this incursion, are we to now to say that negotiations are completely off the table?
I think they're frozen. They're frozen for the time being. And if you think of the logic, the whole incursion into Kursk, people have been scratching their heads to say, what is the strategic goal here? But it's been suggested that Zelensky wants to have a territorial card to play in the mooted ceasefire talks that were supposed to happen in November. And Zelensky himself has called for a second summit. And that he was prepared to invite Russia to the summit. The previous one in Switzerland, Russia didn't come. And that they were hinting that there would be a serious attempt to find a ceasefire. However, as you said, Putin has made it very clear you have to take care of the realities on the ground, which of course means the 4 regions that Russia's annexed, plus the land bridge, plus the Crimea. And that Zelensky, by going into Kursk, has given himself a territorial card. But then Putin's now made it clear, look, we're not going to do ceasefire talks as long as you have some of our territory. And it undermines the whole strategic point of this invasion. And all said and done, I think the Allies as well. I mean, if you read between the lines of the report, nobody believes that the armed forces of Ukraine can actually hang on to Kursk for a protracted length of time. They send in some of their best fighters, best equipment, but they're going to face the whole weight of the Russian army that's going to come at them eventually.
But the incursion by the Ukrainians began on the 6th of August. Today is, of course, the 20th of August. So for almost 2 weeks now, the Russians have not been able to hit back with enough force to push the Ukrainians back in the Kursk region. Why has Russia so far not been able to push back the Ukrainian incursion?
Well, you say able, and that implies the Russians actually want to do that, because it's a question of strengths here that, as you reported along the Donetsk line there in Ukraine itself, the fighting is intense. And what we've been seeing is that Russia has moved some troops out of Ukraine and fallen back to help contain the AFU, which are in Kursk. but surprisingly small amounts and surprisingly weak troops. And the point is, I think, here that Putin, it seems the picture that's emerging is that the Kremlin has decided to, rather than weaken its attack in Donetsk, because that's another strategic goal here, is that the idea is to do a diversion in Kursk and get Russia to remove significant amounts of troops to go to Kursk. And that would relieve the pressure on the front line in Ukraine. Because Ukraine is losing there. I mean, the Russians are making steady advances. And you mentioned the key town of Kursk, that, you know, the Russians are on the verge of taking that. That's a strategic logistical hub.
Right.
And if they get that, they break through into open country behind and then run amok in the same way that the AFU is running amok in Kursk and take on Kramatorsk, which is another key town. And then suddenly the whole Ukrainian line looks like it's going to collapse. So rather than sacrifice that strategic initiative that the Russians are in the middle of for the protection of Kursk, they've just contained the forces and they're willing to just let them sit there because they can't actually do that much now. They've got it. And then make their breakthrough in Ukraine, possibly see the whole Ukrainian line collapse, and then come back to Kursk and deal with the AFU that's still sitting there.
All right, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Ben Aris, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
Shifting focus to the Russia-Ukraine war now, following Kiev's incursion into the Kursk region inside Russia, the Pentagon is trying to get a clear picture of Ukraine's longer-term objectives in the region. And the recent surprise move by Ukraine is changing the trajectory of the war and boosting morale among Ukraine's war-weary population. However, the ultimate outcome of the incursion remains impossible to predict, as Kiev's incursion into western Russia entered its third week. And according to Russian sources, Ukrainian forces have either destroyed or damaged all 3 of the bridges over the Siem River in western Russia.
And so that continues to be our focus. As it relates to their operation in Kursk, as I mentioned, they clearly have compelled the Russians to struggle in their response. It has certainly demonstrated the creativity and the battlefield prowess of the Ukrainians. But when it comes to what their longer-term objectives are here, that's something that we're still discussing with them.
On the other hand, Russia has formed 3 new military groupings to bolster security in regions bordering Ukraine. Russian Defense Minister has held a meeting on issues of military security of border regions amid the Ukrainian incursion into Russia.
We have launched a coordination council on military security issues in the border territories of Belgorod, Bryansk and Kursk regions. The work has already begun. Direct round-the-clock interaction has been established between the regional administrations, the commanders of the troop groups in 3 subsectors of the Russian Federation, and the responsible heads of the headquarters of the Ministry of Defense.
Russian Defense Ministry released a video it said showed the aftermath of a firefight in the Kursk region, in which a number of Ukrainian military vehicles were destroyed by a unit of Russian Marines. In his first visit in nearly 13 years, Russian President Vladimir Putin made an unscheduled trip to Chechnya. Putin was greeted by self-styled strongman leader Ramzan Kadyrov. He then went on to visit a Special Forces Academy bearing his own name and speaking with volunteers fighters who trained there prior to being deployed in Ukraine. Putin later held talks with Kadyrov at the leader's residence. Meanwhile, Russia hit energy infrastructure in northern Ukraine in an overnight missile and drone attack and caused a huge fire in the west of the country. Ukraine's Air Force commander said that its forces shot down 3 ballistic missiles and 25 of the 26 drones launched in the attack in 9 regions across the country. Regional governor said that a 14-year-old boy lost his life from the injuries while he was struggling in the hospital after the Russian munitions struck Ukraine's southern Zaporizhia region. Furthermore, the Russian military said on Tuesday that its forces had taken control of what is described as the strategically important logistics hub of the New York in eastern Ukraine.
While the West is in awe of Ukraine's audacious incursion into Russia's Kursk region, events on the battlefield are rapidly changing. Our next report analyzes how Kiev's tactical gambit has paved the way for significant Russian advances in eastern Ukraine.
Intense fighting continues on multiple fronts in Kursk as Russia claims to slowly reclaim lost ground. Moscow is fortifying its defenses and has seemingly stopped the advance of Ukrainian troops on its territory. It is also replacing a destroyed bridge in Kursk region. Satellite imagery shows how Russia is building pontoon bridges after Ukraine demolished 3 bridges. Ukraine frontline forces in Sumy are launching fresh attacks on Kursk region to inflict damage on Russian forces. 2 weeks ago, Ukraine launched its bold cross-border operation into Kursk, hoping to divert Russian attention and resources away from the intensifying battles in eastern Ukraine. However, despite the initial successes announced by Kiev, Moscow's forces have steadily advanced in Donetsk, capturing key strategic locations. The fall of New York, a key logistical hub in eastern Ukraine, to Russian forces marks a significant setback for Kiev. This loss is not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of Russian territorial gains in the region. The imminent threat to Pokrovsk, another crucial supply node, further underscores the precariousness of Ukraine's position. The Ukrainian High Command's decision to divert substantial forces, including elite airborne units and mechanized brigades, from the critical Donetsk and Kharkiv sectors to the Kursk front, has left a glaring vulnerability in their defensive line. Experts say this reallocation of troops has severely compromised Ukraine's ability to maintain its foothold in the east, particularly in the face of Russia's unrelenting offensive. Adding to Ukraine's woes is the potential opening of a new front, Belarus's deployment of aircraft, air defense systems and armored units to its border with Ukraine. Belarus says the troop deployment is in response to Ukrainian troop buildup, a charge denied by Kiev, but surely adding to Zelensky's woes, as he might be forced to divert even more resources from the critical Eastern Front. Bureau Report, WION, World is One.
Dov Zakhaim is a former Undersecretary of Defense in George W. Bush's administration and currently senior advisor at Center for Strategic and International Studies. Is now joining us live from Washington, D.C. Mr. Zakhaim, thank you for making time for us and welcome. Some experts are saying the enemy is at the gate and that Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has walked into Putin's trap. Your thoughts about that statement?
Well, I don't think it was a trap by Putin. Putin was caught by surprise and really didn't know how to react for almost 2 weeks. So it wasn't a trap. Russia's a very, very big country, and relatively speaking, taking part of the Kursk region isn't all that much. On the other hand, there are a couple of other indicators that show that maybe Zelensky wasn't making, and his high command weren't making that big a mistake. In the first place, they were being pressed already in the east, and they had to figure out a way to force the Russians to consider some kind of trade or at least sitting down to negotiate. They weren't succeeding just by holding the Russians back in the east. That just wasn't working. They got F-16s. The F-16s that they've gotten from America's European allies allows them both to pretty much dominate the skies right now and to hit targets on the ground and to go after the bridges that they knocked out. It's going to be much harder to build pontoon bridges, and those can be knocked out as well. The Russians have a problem there. And yes, they may be getting some territory back, at least they say so. The Ukrainians have a different story, which leaves the Belarus question, whether Lukashenko really wants to get involved in this fight is really uncertain. He's highly unpopular at home. He's probably in many ways the last real dictator in Europe. And if things went wrong for him, he'd be gone. So yes, they're building up. They're trying to draw troops away from Ukrainian troops away from the east. But remember too, the Russians have drawn troops down. They've taken some from Kaliningrad. They've taken some even from the Ukrainian front. So is this a gamble that'll win? Not clear. But is it a gamble that perhaps Ukraine had to take? Definitely, for another reason. Mr. Zelensky has no idea who the next president's going to be. And if the next president is Donald Trump, he's finished.
Mr. Zakhaim, some critics view the Kursk incursion has lifted Ukraine's hopes, but others expect a nightmare in Donbass for Ukraine. Is that the reality on ground?
Well, a nightmare would mean, of course, that all of Donbass falls to the Russians. It hasn't fallen in nearly 2 years, or a year and a half. The Russians might gain some ground, but how much is gaining ground? It's nothing like the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk. So yes, the Russians may take 1 or 2 more cities, but the Ukrainians clearly are not lost there, and it's not obvious that Ukraine's going to be pushed out of Kursk. So yes, there are critics, but remember, these are the same critics who said that Ukraine would never attack Russia. And in fact, the United States has tried very hard to get them not to attack Russia. But other European countries, notably the Brits with Storm Shadow missiles, and the French have spoken about this as well. They're not holding the Ukrainians back. And there will be pressure on Mr. Biden to let loose and let the Ukrainians continue their attacks on Russia and to step up the support that we've been giving them, but far too slowly.
Mr. Zakhaim, for general knowledge purposes and briefly, why is Russia's Kursk region important for Ukraine?
Well, it's important for Ukraine because Ukraine will then have something that they can hold on to as possible negotiating bargain. There's also another reason, and I've written about this. Kursk was the locale of the greatest battle probably ever, certainly the greatest tank battle ever that the Soviets won, and it was the turning point for them, which led to their eventual occupation of Berlin. It's got huge psychological impacts on Russians, and particularly on Putin, who is a student of history. And so losing Kursk is a tremendous